Welcome to Axis Square's first video on disassembling our telescopes. I'm Mike Bradshaw. I'm the founder of Axis Squared. What I have here is a Celestron Powerstar. It is an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain, and it came out in the late 80s. It was the first Celestron telescope to be DC powered instead of AC powered, which then everything after this became DC. And it had this particularly complex control box which could be used to run declination motors, focus motors, had a map light, all sorts of things. So I'm going to remove that for right now, put it off to the side. You'll recognize the Powerstars because they have this before this the cover was basically blank, or it had a window showing the gear inside. The Powerstar was the first one with the DC plug and this kind of complex military style outlet for the hand paddle, and this was for a focus motor, but you could also run it through the hand paddle if you had it. The hand paddle was optional. The wiring was different depending on if you ordered it or not. So if you ordered it with the hand paddle, you have to use the hand paddle from now on. The wiring inside is different. And when you plug it in, the power, here's the hand paddle, and here's a power outlet on here. This is where you actually plug in the power, not onto the telescope itself. So the power goes into the hand paddle, it creates all the voltages needed, and then distributes it out to the various motors. So obviously this one was ordered with the hand paddle, so we need to run it with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disassemble the right ascension assembly, and you're going to watch, and you're going to learn. So I have various tools here. The first step is we need to take off this cover panel, and there are just 4 simple screws here. I have my magnetic tray. We're going to take these off. And just like every good YouTube video, I've already been through this whole assembly to make sure there wasn't going to be any surprises and that everything would come apart nicely. So take the 4 screws off, and then this part just lifts off. And you'll see there's a series of connectors here. When you actually open it up, they'll be connected to these, one-to-one. I disconnected them already. These are very, very thin wires, and it's very easy to damage them when you disconnect these. One of the things I'm going to do to this telescope as part of the upgrade is I'm going to replace these 6 individual connectors with a single 6-pin connector that'll do all of them at once. It'll be much more secure and easier to deal with. So when you open it up, these will be connected. You have to pop each one apart by hand. Be very careful because these wires are small. So this panel now, we can take it and we can put it off to the side, someplace safe. And these wires you just kind of tuck down out of the way. So right now, what we're looking at is this is the worm gear. The worm gear here, the right ascension worm gear, and the worm wheel. This era for Celestron, the worms were made by a company called Buyers. In the earlier models, there was a window here showing the worm gear to show the work. Starting with the Powerstar, they got rid of that window because there was too much other stuff going on. It's still a Buyer's drive in here. And in this era, you can see the worm gear itself is only held on one side, not on both. Some eras there was bearings on both sides, sometimes only on one. But you can see that this bearing here is as large as the worm gear. So it's a big sturdy assembly. It's not a problem with that. And this whole assembly is spring-loaded. There's a spring down in here, which you'll be able to see better in a minute. But the whole assembly is spring-loaded, so that's the preload. But it also means that for us to get this assembly apart, we need to keep that in mind. Otherwise, the worm and the worm wheel are going to bind. Okay. So let's zoom back out, and we'll get a better sense of what's going on here. So we take flathead screwdriver. Okay. This is just a cover. Just pops up. Plastic. That goes out of the way. And make a little more room. This is just a Phillips head screw. It's usually not very tight. There's a screw and a washer. And if I zoom back in, right here where it came out is a bearing, a sealed bearing. That's part of the axis, the right ascension axis. Nothing's going to fall out here, but just so you're aware that that's there. Okay, so now we're going to take we'll zoom back out. And we'll take our optical train here and put it straight. I'm going to take this assembly and turn it sideways. Okay. I'm going to lock it for now, so everything's pinned. I'm going to make some room. We're going to take the entire assembly. Actually, I'm going to turn it this way. Take the entire assembly and carefully put it on its side. Okay. So let me bring this around so we can see what we're dealing with under here. This is the bottom of the telescope. Okay. There's a couple things we're seeing here. Up here is a small Phillips head screw. That is actually threaded into the worm gear housing and helps locate it. So we want to keep that one solid for now. There's a lot of stress on that one right now because of the spring. So leave that where it is. There's a large bolt here. Okay, and that bolt is what we're going to work on, and it's normally very tight. Right now it's finger loose because I didn't tighten it all the way. It's normally tight. And if I come over here and get my socket, that bolt is 16 millimeters socket. So we'll pull the bolt out and we can test whether, at this era, Celestron was mixing American threads and metric threads. Earlier, it was mostly all American, and later it became all metric because they started sourcing the telescopes in China. But at this point, these were still American-made, but they had some metric parts in them. So there's a little bit of a mix what's going on. So we're going to take that bolt out. And there's a few other that I'm going to show you while we're here right now. There's 3 holes. There's one here, and one here. And inside those holes are socket head set screws, okay, threaded in there. So when we take this assembly off, I'll show you what's on the other side tied into them. But this is something that I think that most C8 owners are completely unaware of, and they are part of the kind of clutch drag system for the whole telescope. And there's a way that you can adjust it from the outside here, which is actually pretty creative. So when we get things opened up, I'll look at those some more. So the next step to take this apart is we're going to take our socket wrench and we're going to crack that bolt loose. Sometimes there's a bit of tightness on it. From the factory, I think that they put some thread locker. But pretty much once it cracks loose, it should be pretty easy. You're going to take that out. What you have is a bolt and a washer. And one of the things that I can do here, just to verify with what we're working with, I have a screw checker here. And so it's close to 7/16, but it's not. It is probably 8 or 10 millimeters, but it's clearly a metric bolt in this case. So that, put it off to the side, and your socket you can put off to the side because we're done with that. Let's zoom this back out so we get a better sense of what we're doing here. Swing this back around. So we're gonna disconnect the right extension. So now we're free floating again, okay? If I bring this around here so the camera can see, as I mentioned, we have the worm here, okay? And it's spring loaded, so there's some spring. That's currently holding the assembly together. The worm against the worm wheel is what's holding things together. So if you reach in there with one finger and lift it off the worm wheel, this whole piece will come off. And let's see what we have here. So here is the base. Here's our worm gear. There's our spring load. In fact, this is the spring. So this spring is keeping the whole assembly taut against the worm wheel. Okay, there's two more bolts here. Those two, and then here's the bolt on the backside I already talked about. Those three are locating this assembly right now, keeping it in place. Here's the motor and our wiring. So I talked about these three holes. On the opposite side of them, there's here. Let me zoom in a bit more. But these are nylon bolts. Okay, and they're generally loose, and you can take them out. But it's basically nylon bolt. Okay, and it's hard for the camera to see. I don't know if the camera can see that or not. But there's a cut in the end that you can put a flathead screwdriver in, okay? So what that means is when these are in place, you run them down till they're snug, okay? That's the lowest position. Come over here, and you find your sockets. And you check which one might work. Let's see. There we go. That one will work. So if you take this out, here is the socket head screw. Okay. So now this hole goes all the way through, and your screwdriver can actually go in there, and if you're careful, you feel it. You'll feel it catch the teeth, the hole on the end of that screw. If I bring this back around here, now if we watch this screw from behind, I can access that screw, and I can basically thread it out or thread it in. Okay? So what that means is these three nylon screws, I can change the depth of them from the outside with the telescope closed up. And that's important because those contact the worm gear, and I'll show you that in a minute. I'm going to put the socket back in place so we don't lose it. So what you would do is, when the telescope is off, is all put together but off the mount, you can take those three socket screws out. You can then access each of the, one by one. You can go through and access the screws here, and you can change their height. So remember, the assembly sits like this. So on the ground, the assembly sits like this. And We'll bring this around. This is the actual worm gear itself, and this surface of it sits right down on top of those. Okay? So those nylon screws bear against this surface gently and create some level of friction. And so if the whole assembly seems a little loose or floppy, those can be used from underneath and tightened up and put a little bit of pressure on the worm gear to create a bit of preload and a bit of tension on the drive. Now you don't want too much, you'll bind everything up, but you don't want it too little because there's a little bit of floatiness here in this assembly. So that's designed to get rid of that floatiness. So the drive base we're done with for right now. We can take it and move it off to the side where it's safe. What's important now is this assembly. Okay, so this is all the worm gear assembly and all the associated things in here. There's a couple things to look at. There's some socket head screws. There's some Phillips head screws here, so you can see what spins and what doesn't. And in fact, if I reach around and turn the right ascension slow motion knob, you can see what's spinning here. So this is the worm gear. This piece right here that spins independently is the right ascension setting circle wheel. Okay, so that can move separately, but when you turn the gear, that goes with. There's a little bit of tension between them, and that's the way it's supposed to work. So let's dig into this and see what's inside. First step is these 4 Phillips head screws. These are about 1 inch long, stainless. They go through several assemblies at once. They're usually pretty tight. Let me show you one other thing. There was one thing that I neglected to put back together when I brought this back together. Screwdriver. And this hole here, I'm going to take care of right now. This is another nylon screw. Nylon screws are really good when used as clutch surfaces and things like that. Okay, so here was when it's all opened up first. This is what it's going to look like. There's a nylon screw here. Okay, let's zoom in a bit. So that nylon screw, if you tighten it up, it makes this whole assembly very, very tight and it won't spin. If you loosen it just a little bit, now it can spin. So there's some point there where it catches pretty strongly. And that's another bit of tension between the worm gear and the main housing. Okay, so that's something to be aware of. So let's take that and we'll back it out and we'll put it off to the side. Okay. Nylon worm gear off to the side. We've taken these 2 out already. We'll take these 2 out. And normally, when you open up your telescope, there's going to be grease on all these various surfaces, and like this ring is stuck in place. I've cleaned and degreased everything, so it all comes apart very easily. It's just going to fall apart. On the normal scope, depending on the age and how it's been used, all of this is going to have thick grease in here, all on these surfaces, and everything's going to be kind of stuck together, and it's going to take a little bit of prying and popping to get it apart. But for right now, everything is clean, so that comes off. So this is just a mounting ring, a spacer ring, so that can go off to the side. And there's usually marks on one side that are not on the other. But as far as I can tell, this is symmetric. It doesn't matter which way it goes in the assembly. So that goes off to the side. We then have this whole assembly, which with a little bit of pressure will pop off and come off. So this is now the right ascension circle the worm wheel for the right ascension worm gear, and some housing. That goes off to the side. And then we have a assembly here, and this will wiggle loose and come off. And this, on the back end, that was the little screw that we took out under the cap in the beginning. That's that back end. So that's the bearing on one end, and here's the bearing on the other. So this is the actual right ascension axis bearing assembly. Okay. Here's the rest of the housing. This point right here was where the plug was on before. This is the, I don't know if you can see the little wheel spinning. This is the right ascension slow motion. And there's a gear tooth right up here, a thin gear. That's the main wheel down there. But then the thin gear up here, that's that one. So that's when you spin in right ascension knob, that spins that. And here, this plastic, kind of Teflon-y plastic piece, is right ascension clutch lock. And when you turn the knob, let's see if we can bring this around a bit. So here's the right ascension locking knob. When you turn that knob, there's a screw in there, and it pushes out on this assembly, and this pushes against this surface right here and locks the arm and housing to the worm and everything else. So that's the right ascension lock. So it turns out that the whole assembly can actually sit right now like this. Let me zoom out. So for the time being, you can actually store your telescope like that. This is flat and there's nothing hanging out of the way. So we're going to take the telescope and move it off to the side for right now, and I will be back in 1 second. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. Okay, so this housing, if it was being put together, sits like this. Flip that all over. This piece locks them together. Okay. Time being, take the right ascension axis, put it off to the side, take the spacer ring, clean it up, get the grease off of it, you know, all that, clean the threads in here, but you know, you can do a good job, you can polish it up a bit. That goes off to the side. So now we have this assembly right here. So let's take this apart. So if we flip it over, we have 3 socket screws here in the worm gear itself. And of course I've loosened them earlier. They are pretty tight when you start off with. And these are SAE threads, not metric. So you have 3 screws there into our storage. So now here's the tricky part. This is the back of a screw. So somewhere in here is the front of the screw, and you can't see it or get to it. So that tells us that the worm gear has to come off. And so there's this kind of central hub, and the worm gear has to come off. And the only way I know how to do it is to sit here and muscle it a bit. So what you need to do is, carefully, of course, see if you can find a little bit of a gap. under the worm. And slowly pry it off. So this is not the most interesting part of the video, so we will pause it here while I go through this.